of Kittens and Broken Things, Chapter 13. Lal was making not so much progress in building a team. Track record so far, 1 out of 4. She had rejected several Cerberus candidates. Orbiston had not offered any potential candidates. He was excellent on missions, and he was not going to mutiny. That was really all that Commander Shepard could ask, and although it hurt, she left him alone. He did his job, she did hers. If they didn't exchange bright glances, at least she no longer had to give him Shepard smiles. Unfortunately, their semi-promising introduction on her first overwhelmed and reverie-soaked day back, and Garrus's expectation of friendship with the man, made her feel she'd failed in several ways. She hadn't managed to take care of Garrus's friend. Commander Shepard had failed to inspire. She had his service, but not his approval. She hadn't been able to make a friend. She wanted to be friends, had even considered asking him to act friendly in front of Garrus, but was too mortified at the presumption to attempt that. She dreaded appearing in front of Garrus with Orbiston, them both at an awkward and professional distance. The last time Garrus had seen them together, Garrus had been professing trust and no secrets. Because he didn't know her secrets. There had never been a scenario where you could deliver that. Let it go. Shepard doesn't really have friends. She only has goals. You're not responsible for Garrus's assumptions or promises. You just wish you could be. She was anxious about seeing Garrus alone. His messages had begun to promise retribution for her continuing choice to not answer him. It had been 3 weeks since leaving the Citadel, and she had no real reason to report to the Council. She was building a team and gathering intelligence. They had not sent her on a mission, only given her the resources to determine her own mission. So that's what she did. Garrus had, ironically, provided her with the power to not have to check in with him. Excellent for her mission and security. Not excellent in Garrus's opinion, that she had found no way, at any point in these weeks, to find a mundane or heroic measure to prove she was alive, or that she missed him, or that she cared that he missed her. She had thought he would know that she cared, that it was only about security. But her betting on his sense of Turian duty to ensure he followed her dictates was not paying off. In fact, it was putting her deeper in a hole. She believed that when he recorded a message to her now, he was purposely holding his Omnitool and looking down at it so when she saw the message, it simulated the height and steep angle at which he'd tower over her if he were holding her in place, say, against a door, for instance. She thought about his kiss, and the stomach flutters and near prickle of sweat under her skin was an excellent example of how thinking about Garrus was distracting. His latest message was in his "I am a reasonable person and you are not" voice, which was 1 part intimidation and 1 part seduction, and altogether too effective at both.
Kara, beloved, dearest, you're making me unnecessarily crazy. See, when I used to get crazy, I'd shoot something. But now when I get crazy, I get creative. Do you need a code? A courier? Smoke signals? What would make me less crazed and you more secure? You need to compromise. Find a way. Worry less about Reapers for an hour and use your talented problem-solving skills. I refuse to believe that you can come back from the dead but not record a message. Speak to your bondmate. I love you. I'm not saying I'm going to kill you for this, just that I want to. Sleep well.
As though she didn't spend hours worrying about Garrus in a day, alternately intimidated and seduced. Was he getting read receipts? Did he know she played his messages over and over? Oh, no. She could not give in and answer. Regardless of his escalation, it would be a permanently tragic misstep. A precedent set. She could avoid missteps when she was at a distance, when she could think. She needed to use this time to think about what he suggested. She did not want creative Garrus. She had to be prepared to renegotiate, and that's what he was telling her. She would have to give him something. She would have to find a way to speak to him, or else he would continue this escalation to its disastrous conclusion. She just couldn't tell him until she saw him, and she did not know when she would see him, and she had really only put the truest restriction on reverie and sex. She was not in the least worried that he was going to kiss her or force her in any way. That wasn't the problem. The problem was heroic, creative Garrus convincing her to take that first tiny step in his direction that would lead directly to her, kissing him, and then gravity and reverie and every yes she'd saved up in a flood, beginning with those butterflies, building with his voice, and falling, and lovely things happening, and then you are Mrs. House Arrest Vicarian. No, that is not a good thing. He knew that communication could be handled somehow, possibly just between their high-security Omni-Tool links, but she did not know that was true. She was just recently dead, but she did know she had busted Citadel security before that death. But he was right. If she was going to put unreasonable restrictions, she needed to find unreasonable solutions. Wouldn't it be lovely to hear his voice, the last thing before she fell asleep? Not delivering death threats? Face it, even his voice making death threats is a beautiful thing. Voice carries no reverie, just lots and lots of butterflies. And ideas. Don't forget the man's ideas. Forget the man's ideas for now. Okay, back to Shepard business. Of the other proposed teammates, Jack was a nightmare of offenses and criminal history. Pass. She'd been intrigued by Okeer, and she and Morden had been excited about the science involved, but she'd ended up with the consolation prize of a baby in a bottle. She had remembered the rejected Krogan sent to die in the pit, and she decided she did not want a monotone Krogan programmed by a madman. Med Krogan. Krogan, Med Krogan. Mix them up in any order, it was the same conclusion. Pass. She dropped the tank off on Tuchanka as a courtesy to Rex because she was not a suitable nanny. Those were the practical concerns, but the ethical concerns were that she would be taking a life programmed to hate and kill, and potentially force them into slavery. Yes, she had already decided she couldn't spend her life on science projects, but beyond that, the Krogan in the tank was a person. They were adult-sized, but not adult-minded. They had no choices yet. Perhaps Rex could give them choices and education. They deserved a chance at life. She could not force them to choose death by default because they knew nothing else. It was really nice seeing Rex. Interesting life when being welcomed and then playfully hazed by a Krogan clan leader is relatively relaxing. They could not go after any collector targets until Morden was done with his countermeasure, and that was not yet. She'd lost some ground on the baking front as well, but she'd gained allies. Yes, she was very strange, and she had an oven of sorts in her quarters. It was not technically a fire hazard. An odd design, Mass Effect technology, and modular. She could break it down and store it. Okay, she had a lot of extinguishers in case of a problem. She also had a lot of baking components and recipes. Thankfully, even traditionally fresh ingredients like eggs and milk could be reliably simulated in dried form. The final result wasn't the best, but it was better than most things the Normandy galley had to offer. It relaxed her. She had explained that to Top repeatedly. Top still didn't seem to get it, and did not wish to be used as a potholder or trivet, but her combat gauntlets and a spare ablative plate worked in a pinch, so she respected Top's wishes. But she got caught. Sort of. Not tragically, but definitively. It was Joker and Edie. They told her they'd seen her sneaking a batch into the fridge. She wasn't really terrified, but she did blush as Joker told her. So the mystery of the SR-1 brownies is solved, unless this is a copycat crime? No, I confess. I like baked goods. She did not confess that she made them. Turns out, so do I. Do you know those raspberry cookies with the powdered sugar? Linzer tarts? You're probably not supposed to know their name. But I do. Jig is up, I suppose. Jig can stay down. I suddenly realize I don't know what a jig is or why it's up or what down is. Question for the ages. No, I'm going to look it up as soon as I leave. Don't carry on about your fascination with etymology. Stop there. You need any help with smuggling in cookies? I'll say they're from my aunt. I'll say she heard about the disappearing brownies from me. She wants to contribute to the war effort, and she likes Linzer tarts. Those.
I can arrange for a drop-off spot in the cargo hold. I will label it ballistics gel.
Nice touch.
Thank you.
Operation Tart Caper was a go. Ooh, that sounded vaguely dirty. Lal chose to head to Ilium, set in there, and was so glad to see Liara. She brought Orbiston with her and Caden, because she was certain Liara would enjoy seeing them both, which turned out to be true. Liara got a giant Russ, lifty spinny hug, and a laugh, and Lal was, alas, entirely and inappropriately jealous. She checked in with Liara regarding a not terribly helpful dossier. Thane Krios, quick kill biotic specialist, expert sniper. Thane Krios is a Drell trained from childhood as an elite assassin, proficient in both long-range sniping kills and close infiltration. He has slowed his activities in recent years, but is rumored to have a target on Ilium. Lal confessed, I got nothing else on this guy. I'm afraid my hacking skills come up short when there's nothing to be found. Liara gave her a contact to pursue, confirming that Thane was likely on Ilium. Most of what she could provide on him was composed of unconfirmed rumors. Nisana Dantius was the likely target of his presence. Lal remembered Nisana. There was quite a bit on Nisana Dantius in Garrus's pile of actionable info. That someone wanted her dead was not a surprise. That she deserved to die was not in question. She could not fault Cercrios for his choice of target. Liara told her, "Unfortunately, there is not much else to know about him that I could find, either." "Have you worked with many Drell?" "Oh, yes. I've been lucky. Farron," she directed the comment to Orbiston, who said, "If only you would let us recruit him." Such a nice voice when he was friendly. "Absolutely not. I'd be unable to function." Lal asked about another dossier, an Asari Justicar named Samara. Lal could stay on Ilium for a while, get these recruitment issues done, plan her next moves. Maybe she could ask Liara for some recommendations, but she'd see how these two went first. Before she left, Liara spoke privately to Lal. "I'm sure you could use a break from the Normandy berthing. There's an apartment here. I'd like you to take it when you're in port. I'd love to be able to visit." Maybe Lal could ask for Liara's assistance in setting up encrypted communication and relay that to Garrus for her. Lal imagined Liara and Caden and Orbiston meeting at a bar, drinking and telling stories, and she was intimidated and jealous of the scene, but she said only a grateful, "That sounds lovely. Thank you." Liara sent her the coordinates and access codes. "Any time you're in port, every time, come stay. Please." It wasn't a spinny hug, but Lal got a Liara hug on the way out, headed up to meet with her contact, and then moved quickly on to Dantius Towers. The fact that there was no information on Thane made him a potentially extraordinary asset. She desperately needed more heavy-hitting ranged weapons specialists, and Thane appeared to qualify both for up-close melee and ranged. A rare combination of skills. Her ranged skill was not the best. Orbiston blew her away in potential, if not always in execution. She had the use of mainly overload and a pistol. He had his hands and his will. He rarely used a gun. His biotic cooldowns were exceptional. She was only comparable with hands and will if it was a terminal she was facing and not a charging Krogan. Once someone made it into Orbiston's physical reach, instead of being helpless as many biotics would be, he was more lethal. He was the best there was. The best she'd seen, anyway, hand to hand. There was no question why he was a Spectre. He could kill her in moments. She no longer thought he might, fortunately, but she had seen him turn charging Krogan into suddenly ex-Krogan. She thought Orbiston took particular relish in those kills, ranked them higher in value than those who never got close enough to see death in gray eyes. She'd like to think her personal fascination with all things Drell was not influencing her hopes of Cercrios as a candidate, but that was unlikely. Sylvie had specialized in Drell spirituality and history, and Kara had spent hundreds of hours in her library, dreaming over pictures and stories of lost Rakana. Sylvie had her own stories she'd learned from Drell themselves, and that had been so romantic. She considered Liara's gift of a hopefully beautiful apartment later, and maybe even, a bubble bath. A bubble bath and quiet. Maybe a few candles. A book with absolutely no intellectual value, but rich in size. Room service and take-out menus with new things on them. Sorry things she hadn't tried. It was a date, she promised herself. I wish Garrus were here. No, you don't. I really do. stop. She hated going after Cercrios physically instead of diplomatically. There was a high probability that Cercrios would evade or try to kill them as perceived threats, possibly force them to kill or injure him in self-defense. She could not get any more information on him, and Liara's attempts to bait contracts had not resulted in him arranging a meeting. She could not get a psychological profile on him. Cerberus had had years to research him and had produced only a dossier with 5 scant, unhelpful lines. Bait became unusable as a method. He would likely evade them if they attempted to detain him on the way in or out, and the only place she could predict he would be was in proximity to Nasana. Even then he could opt for a sniper's rifle from an unreachable nest. Lal had run out of time, and unless she used this intel to her best advantage at high risk, he'd be gone, and she would have to abandon the resources and time spent so far trying to speak to him, making her track record 1 out of 5. She needed a win, badly. She was grateful to be doing something in her own way. There had to be more competent people in the galaxy. They couldn't all be this difficult to find. Every colony would be taken before she got the chance to help. Moving through the towers was relatively easy. Orbiston and Alenko were now practiced and efficient, most setups obvious in how she would strategically arrange them. There were no major challenges, and they required 0 direction. Comm channels quiet as they found their places, according to the tactical protocols she had laid out and they had grasped. Kaidan with more practice, but Orbiston with strict adherence to command structure, and being brilliant in his own right. Boot camp was over. He no longer offered alternatives, belligerently or otherwise. He rarely spoke at all except to Kaidan. They seemed to like each other, both of them discussing biotic methods and stories, and her listening avidly but quietly. Her attention turned to anything but them. The biggest surprise was that there were Solarian survivors that seemed to have been protected along the way by Cercrios. Please, let this be true. I need a good person. Nasana made it difficult to be polite to her, but that did not last for long. Thane Krios dropped through the ceiling and, without their help, killed 4 people in a few seconds. As an audition, it took about as much time for her to make up her mind as she had with Masani, her judgment as strong but in the opposite direction. She needed him. She hadn't seen the phenomena for a while, so she blinked. Maybe her eyes were blurred from staring. No, that was not it. Thane Krios was glowing. Oh. Then he appeared to be praying, and she waited, unwilling to interrupt. She knew that place. She held it dear. Reminiscent of moments around the table at Sanctuary, and moments speaking to the sky, and to fate. Maybe he prayed to the gods of the Drell people. She nearly bowed her head in sympathetic response. She recognized devotion in the still bleeding, but would bleed no more radius of fate and death. She recognized the sweeping beginnings of a sacred circle drawn, and the awaited and predicted completion of that gesture. Thane lifted his eyes to the intruders after his prayer. He was surprised. He had predicted dying by now, mid-prayer. They were at range, armed and armored. He had focused only upon his purpose. Amankara would guide him, and Kalahira would take him. It would be a good death. He was likely no more or no less educated about the people that faced him than most citizens of the galaxy. They were all recognizable. Spectre Lal Shepard, Spectre Hemoris Orbiston, Lieutenant Kittens Alenko. Orbiston and Alenko had guns drawn and the willingness to kill on their faces. To that, Thane was accustomed. Yet Commander Shepard stood quietly, to all appearances, respectful of his prayer. There was something sacred in her eyes, blinking only once after his eyes met hers, and then opening to some strands of the ineffable that harmonized with his prayer. Her weapon was holstered. He believed that she was waiting for him to speak first. So one game ended, and another game began immediately, his fingers reaching for the first piece to move. A new board spread out before him. There were rules to all games. Liberties, restrictions, purposes. Given enough moves, he would grasp her purpose. If he made a false move, the guarantee in Spectre Orbiston's eyes was that it would be his last. That was acceptable. She was a woman woven into the fabric that created the state of the worlds, armies and policies and influence. She had been of more value dead than most while they lived, her memory held up as a template and a banner. She had placed the counselor for her own race, having earned the right to create the position by saving the lives of the current Solarian and Asari counselors. She was linked to the current Turian counselor who had served on her crew, as had Lieutenant Alenko. Spectre Orbiston was a close friend to the Turian counselor. She was linked through persistent gossip to Vicarian romantically through secret bond. By proxy, the council stood in this room, and he stood before them. She seemed, through the passage of prayer and power, to fill the room. Siha. The word came to him not in a voice, but as though written in the sand after a wave had withdrawn. Silence. He let the moment linger for its purity, then broke the silence to acknowledge her intent to be polite, and his to reciprocate. Her first move was to wait until he made his first move. Spectre Shepard, what is it you seek? It sounded like a riddle a wise woman spoke to a supplicant in the desert the way he said it, and she seemed to hear it the same way. Someone must turn poetry to prose, or perhaps Orbiston and Alenko would not lower their weapons. With a slight gesture from her hand, the weapons were down. Orbiston and Alenko did not lose their willingness to kill. It was only submerged. So something revealed by a wave, and something swallowed. There was in her gesture, in her eyes, the power of the deep sea, assuring him he would not drown if he merely beheld the shore. Her first and second moves had not been wasted. Most would have chosen attempted intimidation. She certainly had that at her disposal. He was beyond the reach of intimidation. There was nothing she could use to threaten him, nor was death a concern. It would in fact be a mercy. He could not be tortured. He would end his own life if it were attempted, several methods available undetected on his body, none requiring the use of his hands. He could not be used against his will, for that would require him being at liberty to pursue methods others could not. Those who had tried had discovered his will, and his methods did not bend in that manner. He made other things bend and break when pressed, in order to discourage further attempts. Fear was not her chosen weapon. We would have preferred a different introduction. This is traumatic, and I apologize. Unfortunately, there are many reasons why you would not wish to meet with a specter. Or two. Her lips did not exactly smile, but did pull at the acknowledgment of the understatement. He was trained to avoid authority, and he was now in the room with possibly the one person with the most authority over past and future events that determined life and death for all, flanked by enforcers with enough determination to bring that about. Thane had existed in shadows. These three represented the light. Sia. We don't represent any threat to you personally, Sir Krios. Finding no other path to establishing trust or contact, we found you at the only place or time available to us. This is the only introduction we could arrange. We would like to speak with you. More politeness. Was it tailored to him, or was she this person? Questions and curiosity began to form, as though he had poured water and it had defied gravity, his expectant cup held empty and his eyes drawn up along the impossible trail of the mundane under unidentified extraordinary circumstances. How? Defiance. That is what Spectre Shepard was known for, and at the moment she defied what should be taking place. 2 council spectres and an alliance agent pursue a wanted criminal caught in witnessed multiple murder, a criminal whose bounties and information alone could bring a corrupted spectre personal gain, and any flavor of spectre a name-making boost of fame. Who would Shepard be without Saren? Who would Orbiston be without Nemeris? Perhaps Spectre, Alenko, would be linked to Krios. Had she wanted that, however, she would not be speaking. Forewarned, she would have had any number of ways to subdue him without his consent, and would have prepared for that. So he would consider that she was perhaps telling what people rarely told or heard in his presence. The truth. Given enough moves, it would be revealed for what it was, because what could not be concealed through much of play was the end purpose of the game. She had always opposed Reapers. It was not unreasonable that she still did, and was not his enemy. Regardless of the makings of Spectre, Alenko, the name of Krios was unknown to most by design, and making a case for his past, which did not exist, was unlikely to be their purpose if he was not yet dead or taken. None of them would have difficulty functioning in the presence of dead bodies, and arranging a later meeting point would not suit his curiosity or likely her purposes. He would not meet with a spectre after having been permitted to evade her. But a Siha he wished to meet. Physically, she was unimpressive. The skin of her face was leached of color, scattered with irregular faded rust-colored speckles. Her adornments were sweat, grit, and the scent of heat sinks and ozone. Her red hair was in a military cut, short, lank with sweat. Other than her eyes, which were notable for color and intelligence, she was wholly nondescript. He could pass her on the street, and his eyes would recognize no threat, allure, or ambition. She was dwarfed by Orbiston, even by Alenko, thin and pale and without the customary artful cosmetics of most humans he'd encountered. She seemed not entirely adult, not entirely alive, perhaps, after her sojourn into death, her skin denying that red could flow under it. He imagined applying vivid color to her lips and eyes and mouth, smoothing her complexion, and she would still be unremarkable. Yet still a Siha, not one of obvious and rich beauty, not like his Irikah. But her eyes, her depth, her silent tide, and her defiance. Sir Krios, we hope to oppose agents of the Reapers, the Collectors. They have been taking colonists of all species. They have taken colonies of the Drell. We would like to stop them from doing that. We would like you to help us. In what capacity? We find them. We kill them. He noticed one more thing. She said often, we and us, and not I. Yet another distinction in her presentation. Not as narcissistic as he was accustomed, or aware of the usage and mindful. Not as narcissistic as he was himself. Was it possible that absolute power did not, in fact, corrupt? Absolutely? He had not met an exception to that rule. He certainly was not one himself. If she were that exception, she would be Siha. He had served the memory of Rakana for the majority of his life, and with the minority of his life remaining, if he could stop those who left Drell habitations echoing empty, he would. I find those terms acceptable. My arm is yours. Payment is unnecessary.